Dr. Foster, if I can just go back briefly to the discussion we were having before lunch. Was there anything else you can recall that you learned, whether from your interactions with the union or with the journalists that you described, which cast any light on the issue of the Department of Health decision-making in relation to the sale to Beecham, as far as you can recall? Yes. When Mr. Flynn phoned me to say that they had prepared a programme that was going to be broadcast the following Monday, he said this was based on a discovery that his colleague, Michael Gillard, had made. And in his research, he had discovered that the Minister had a personal interest in Beecham's. That was the matter that was put to the Minister, and it was following that that this decision was taken by the Department of Health not to privatise Beecham's. Now, it may well be, obviously, the Department of Health might have a different perspective on that, but thank you for making that clear, and we can obtain such other evidence as may be appropriate in due course. So can I then move to the question of PFC's capacity to fractionate not just plasma collected in Scotland, but plasma collected from elsewhere? You've referred in your witness statement to a number of documents in that regard, and I want to just have a look at them with you and then invite your observations on some of the broader issues. If we start with WITN 69144041, please. This was the job ad that you responded to, if we go over to the second page. The Scottish National Blood Transfusion Association Protein Fractionation Centre, application invited for the post of senior biochemist. So that's the application you responded to in the early 70s, which resulted in you taking up the post in 1973. That's correct. And if we just go to the next page, we've got a job description there, and if we just look at the top half of the page, please, Sally, thank you. So the second sentence in the first paragraph refers to new premises being under construction, and then it says the centre has the prime function of processing human plasma collected in regional transfusion centres in Scotland, and later in North England to provide materials for clinical use. So is it right to understand your perspective when you took on the job, your understanding was that the PFC would be fractionating plasma supplied from the north of England? Yes, that's correct. And then if we pick up another document exhibited to your statement, WITN 69140007, this is the letter you referred to, I think, earlier when I was asking you about the evidence that you gave to the Lindsay Tribunal. It's a letter from Mr. Watt to Dr. O'Riordan Blood Transfusion Service Board in Dublin, 11th of November 1975. And we can just, I think, get a sense of Mr. Watt's thinking if we look at the paragraph on the bottom half of the page. So if we could zoom in on that, please, Sally. So this is Mr. Watt, November 1975. The PFC was designed to handle a minimum of 1,500 litres of plasma per week, working on a 46-week year, but with capacity to increase to at least 3,000 litres per week. Of this plasma, it was expected at the 1,500 litre level to process 200 litres of fresh plasma, with the remainder as outdated or partly aged plasma. At the level of 3,000 litres per week, it was expected that 1,000 litres would be provided as fresh plasma. The plasma was expected to come from Scotland and from the English Blood Transfusion Service on a contract basis. The minimum level of working, it was expected that 1,000 litres of plasma would come from Scotland each week and the remaining 500 litres would come from England. How this will work in practice is difficult to define at the present time, since there is no plasma available in England to send to Scotland. Elstree is, for the present, able to absorb all available plasma from the English Blood Transfusion Service. This is a matter for some concern, since it affects the economic viability of this centre. And then if we go over the page, Mr. Watt describes the way in which the centre was designed, and then the bottom half of the page, thank you, he sets out the position as at the end of 1975. He refers to there being a current stockpile and the like. So 2 points potentially emerging from Mr. Watt's letter. The first is that, is this right, or rather was this your understanding, that the way in which the centre had been designed by Mr. Watt from the outset was in the expectation that it would accommodate plasma not just from Scotland but from elsewhere?
That's right, yes.
And then his concern at the end of 75 is that isn't happening, and that may impact upon the economic viability of the centre.
Yes.
Do you recall any discussions or conversations with him on that issue?
Yes. Mr. Watt was a consultant for a number of countries. He consulted for Canada, he consulted for New Zealand, he consulted for Iran, and in the process of that work, he reached a view that to be economically viable, a fractionation centre should support a population of at least 15 million. So the population of Scotland is too small, in his opinion, for this to be economically viable. And that is why he saw England as being essential to the future survival of PFC, as well as obviously to the benefit of England.
Now, if we then pick matters up in your witness statement, Sally, could we have WITN 6914001? And if we go to page 152, if we pick matters up in paragraph Roman numeral 5, so just a little further down, thank you. You say, I was present at a meeting in 1976 that Mr. Watt held with full-time trades union officials to discuss how changes to conditions of employment should be negotiated to enable shift working to be introduced. Do you have any greater recollection of that meeting, or what the response was of the union officials?
I have a vague memory that Mr. Watt was wanting to find out how he could take this forward, and he was advised by the trade union officials the terms and conditions of employment were negotiated through the Whitley system that was in place, and that is how he should proceed. And I really heard nothing more after that from the trade union side, and all I heard from Mr. Watt was reports of these meetings that are mentioned here later, where he gave briefings to the PFC management team, but there were rather vague descriptions of problems emerging, and he wasn't sure if they could be sorted out. We didn't hear anything in any detail at all, and I have to say the staff in general knew nothing of this. They were completely in the dark.
Well, if we just pick up these two meetings, although you weren't present at them, there are a couple of matters where I'm hoping you may be able to help us understand a little more about what was being said. So the first meeting that you've referred to is WITN 6914042. And we can see it's a meeting of the 11th of March 1977. And it's a joint DHSS SHHD meeting. If we go, the bottom of the page of this page is a discussion about fractionation needs, and then it says the effective fractionation capacities for the above products of the UK central laboratories were, and then the figure for Elstree and Oxford, 1,400 litres plasma per week, Edinburgh, 1,500 litres plasma per week, supply sufficient, I think that probably means for Scotland's needs, and then reference to a shortfall in capacity. If you go over the page, I just wanted to pick up the next two paragraphs. PFC Edinburgh's effective capacity was, however, much lower than its potential capacity due to the problem in the present phase of incomes policy of entering into an agreement with the trade unions on shift working. Now, if we just leave aside a moment the issue about incomes policy and shift working, do you have an understanding of what's meant by effective versus potential capacity here?
Yes, it means operating a continuous flow process for a longer period of time. And that required staff working longer periods of time.
Okay, so that's the potential capacity.
Yes.
And then there's reference there to what could be achieved if a shift system were introduced. Capacity could rise to 6,000 litres plasma per week, 3 shifts, or 3,000 litres per week, 2 shifts. The extra cost was not expected to be more than about £30,000 a year. As the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service could produce no more than 1,500 litres of plasma per week, the additional quantities of plasma required to keep Liberton functioning economically would have to come from England. A 2-shift system could just be viable on a turnover of 2,000 litres per week, which suggested that initially England would have to supply an additional 500 to 600 litres per week. English/Welsh RTDs would be consulted about the possibility of this. And then there's reference to the planning for the Liberton plant having been on the assumption that it would receive 500 litres of time-expired plasma a week from England and Wales. And then paragraph 2.3...
Just if I may, just one question rising out of what's in that text. The suggestion is that the capacity could rise to 3,000 litres per week, 2 shifts, but 6,000, 3 shifts. Why is it double for a 3-shift system over 2 shift? What's missing in the 2-shift system? What makes it able to do that?
I'm not really sure I can answer your question. I'll have to think about it.
Because mathematically, the 1,500 1 shift, 3,000 2 shifts, that figures. But on that basis, it will be 4,500 for a 3-shift system.
It could be that this time taken to shut down and clean things out has to be taken into account.
So, why wouldn't that apply to the 2-shift system?
Well, it would. So, yes, I can't answer your question, actually. It's a good point.
Thank you.
Yes, that may potentially just remain
a mystery.
A mystery. And then paragraph 2.3, SHHD said they'd explored all possible approaches to settling the dispute at PFC Edinburgh, but the PTB Whitley Council management side were unable to make an acceptable offer because of current pay policy. The chairman agreed it was essential to try to break the existing deadlock and to raise the matter again within DHSS if SHHD would supply full details. The new round of pay policy being drawn up might provide opportunities which the present policy did not provide. It would, of course, be necessary to ensure that the additional plasma would be available in the event of the dispute being settled. And the discussion continues. I don't think I need to ask you to look at the rest of it. I'll come back to some observations you make in your statement about the incomes policy point in a few minutes. But this appears to suggest that there was a dispute at the PFC and that there was an inability on the part of Whitley Council to make an acceptable offer. Were you involved with the union, with the ASTMS at this time?
Yeah, I was chair of the union group at that time.
And do you have any knowledge of what might be being referred to here when it talks about the dispute?
No, I'm afraid I don't, no. I think in general the staff were receptive to a shift system if it was properly negotiated, and it would have made their job a lot easier.
We'll come back to some of the other matters more thematically, as I say, in a few moments. The second meeting that you referred to in your statement is at WITN 69144043. So this is now August 1977, and it's described as a joint DHSS-SHHD meeting on mutual problems. It's held at the PFC, and we can see that Mr. Watt was present for this meeting. If we look, well, we've got heading plasma from BPL to PFC. Paragraph 3.1 refers to Dr. Maycock having written to the DHSS to the effect that 25,000 litres of plasma per year, 500 litres per week, would be available for fractionation by the PFC. It was thought that this could begin in the autumn. The product required would be PPF. So that's protein plasma fraction, PPF, we're talking about there. Is that right, Dr. Foster?
That's correct.
Yeah. And then if we go to the next paragraph, we see Dr. Lane, who was due to take over from Dr. Maycock, saying it was his intention to concentrate on the production of factor VIII at BPL. The latter and the laboratory at Oxford were both funded by DHSS. It would be wrong, in his view, to send plasma from RTCs in England to the PFC if this had the effect of leaving spare capacity at Elstree and meant service charges having to be paid. In his view, this would have the effect of duplicating costs. He envisaged that only time-expired plasma would be sent to the PFC and was unwilling to enter into any long-term agreement to have regular quantities of plasma fractionated in Edinburgh. And then paragraph 3.3, it was, however, pointed out that any fundamental departure at this stage from what had already been agreed about the fractionation by the PFC of plasma from England, the original intention had been that the plasma should be from the North of England transfusion centres, could seriously jeopardise the working arrangements in the PFC and in particular could raise questions about the need to introduce shift working. While the PFC could function with or without plasma from England, a sustained commitment to processing English plasma required agreement on regular quantities of plasma, providing continuity of production over a period of some years. It was therefore necessary for the English BTS to consider and state the quantity and nature of processing to be carried out and the period over which such a service would be required so that the PFC could plan accordingly. The PFC had been planned to cater for plasma from England, and therefore both SHHD and DHSS were answerable to ministers for the maximum and most economic use of the facility. And then the discussion continues over the page. I won't, I think, because there is obviously quite a lot we need to go through all of it, but we can see there's a discussion under the heading shift working at PFC, paragraph 5.1. It suggests that there's been a failure to reach agreement on the introduction of shift working through the Whitley machinery. And the suggestion that's therefore made is that a case should be prepared for the PFC to be accepted as a pharmaceutical factory-type development with a staffing structure out with Whitley arrangements. And that was going to be sent to the Civil Service Department for comments. And then, if we go... Well, actually, I don't think the meeting actually leads to any particular conclusion. If we just go over to page 4... paragraph 15 says there was general agreement the meetings were a valuable means of exchanging views between administration and directors and should continue. The next meeting would be in London, but the date would depend on the rate of progress in resolving the problems of shift working arrangements on which the future progress and cooperation depended.
May I just ask, do we know who, that is either DHSS or SHHD, took the minutes of this meeting?
No. I have to say, in appearance, in terms of both typeset and the way in which it's set out and what's not at the top of the page, it looks very similar to documents we've seen produced by the Department of Health. But that's a rather casual comment on my part. I'm sure we can find the answer to that because this version of the document's been produced by Dr. Foster as an exhibit to his witness statement.
Yes.
The inquiry will if it's a DHSS document, the inquiry will probably have it as a DHSC from DHSC files, and I can find out the answer to that.
Well, the reason I ask is that it's not unknown for documents prepared by a person who is, as it were, on one side of an argument to reflect that side more favourably than the other.
Yes, it was chaired by someone from the SHHD, and it took place at the PFC, but I don't know whether that casts any further light on it. I'll do my best to find out the answer to that overnight, sir.
Thank you.
Dr. Foster, obviously you weren't present at this meeting, but do you have any recollection of Mr. Watt reporting back to you or your colleagues at the PFC about what was being discussed here?
Yes, he reported back to the PFC heads of department at both of these meetings, the previous one and this one. But as I said, that was in more general terms. He wasn't very specific about what the problem was. But he did go on to say that they were now looking into the possibility of PFC being considered as part of the civil service and having our terms and conditions changed to civil service arrangements. And we then waited to see what would happen, and nothing happened. It just all went dead.
In your capacity with the union, the ASTMS, if that matter had been taken further forward, do you think you would have known of it?
Certainly, yes.
And as far as you're aware, did any further meetings take place involving Mr. Watt on this issue?
I'm not aware of any.
Is it right to understand then that from your perspective at the PFC, this issue of fractionating plasma from England then essentially went into abeyance for a period of time until around 1981?
Yes,
when there was the shift working trial. And do you recall any expression of frustrations or concerns or indeed any other sensation from Mr. Watt during that time?
Yeah, he was enormously frustrated the whole time. He felt that PFC needed more plasma to be economically viable, and he saw it as his role to achieve that. And he was still sort of nagging away to try and get that done.
So I think we then next pick matters up in the autumn of 1981 in terms of your own knowledge and perspective. So if we go to SPTS 0001455_012. This is an article, September, October 1981, and it records a visit by representatives of the ASTMS, the union to which he belonged, to the Edinburgh Centre. If we just scroll down slightly, please, Sully. In fact, if we pick it up, bottom of the page, left-hand side. So it's not entirely clear in terms of what's printed there, but I'm going to try and read the last two paragraphs on the left-hand side. The delegation had the opportunity to meet the ASTMS representative, might be, or representatives, and had lengthy discussions with the director of the centre.
It'd be representatives again, I think.
Yes, from the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service, the Common Services Agency, and then looks like it's something around the plant. Became clear during these, might be discussions, that some tentative, and I'm not sure the next word, have been made about something private drug company, something in the centre. Well, in any event, I think I'll pick it up. So it talks about some investment is, and then we go to the next column, top of the next column, which happily is entirely clear, progressing in the Edinburgh Centre with the building of a new bacteriology laboratory. It was pointed out...
I think now that it's reduced,
yes, it's slightly
it's easier to read. And it maybe had been made about the viability of private drug companies investing in the centre. And it does, given or even, I don't know, the Scottish Home and Health Department had not been consulted, involved to the same extent as the DHSS, etc. Can't quite work out the last line.
No. In any event,
sorry. Can I just comment?
Yes.
This really follows on from the earlier discussion about the plans to possibly privatise BPL. And I think the trade unions were also concerned that that might be applied in Scotland, and that was, I think, that's what they were concerned with.
And then, in any event, we can see, if we pick it up in that second column, it was pointed out by the Centre's director that there was capacity in the plant to increase production considerably without high-scale new investment. Some 90% of the blood products used in Scotland are manufactured in the Edinburgh Centre, making Scotland virtually self-sufficient. It was stressed, however, that the plant was considerably underutilised and could process blood to serve a population of around 25 million. The capital investment needed to increase production would be mainly in the area of new warehousing and storage facilities. Of course, such an increase would require running the plant for longer periods and would inevitably lead to the introduction of a shift system. And then there is a reference to talks being held between the DHSS and the Scottish Home and Health Department with the view to looking at the possibility of the plant serving some of the blood product needs south of the border. I don't think I need to read the rest of that. But so that's an article from the perspective of one of the officials within the STMS, as I understand it, Gordon Craig. Is that right, Dr. Foster?
That's correct, sorry.
And we'll see later on, in a different context, some of your communications with him. Now, that then led to, or the next event, I should say, that you refer to in your statement is the trial that was carried out at PFC towards the end, I think, of 1981. You weren't present during the actual trial, because your statement tells us you were absent with illness. But what was your understanding of what was going to be happening?
My understanding was that this was a physical proof that the system could do what Mr. Watt was claiming it could do, so he wasn't just extrapolating on the basis of calculations, but was demonstrating in practice that the system could actually do what he claimed it could do. And
do you were you involved in any of the discussions about how that would be done and how many shifts it would be and how long it would go on for?
No, I wasn't.
If we then go to...
I might say, when I returned from illness, I did hear from, kind of indirectly from the staff involved, that it was meant to last for 3 weeks, but it only ran for 2 weeks because they ran out of plasma.
I think we can get a sense of Mr. Watt's perspective from a document at SPTS 0000612_026. So we can see this document is entitled Notes on an Interim Report on a Study of the Continuous Fractionation of Plasma by J.G. Watt, November 1981. And if we go over the page...
Could I just
yes.
comment there? This is a note by Professor Cash on John Watt's report.
Thank you. And so we can see the introduction... so sorry, if we just go to the next page, can you help us with this? The underlined passages are those Dr. Cash's notes on what Mr. Watt said.
That's my understanding, yes.
Thank you. So if we go back to the previous page, we can see under the heading introduction, it says during the run-up period to what became known as the PFC shift experiment, became evident that DHSS was particularly interested in the production of plasma protein fraction rather than stabilised purification protein solution. There's further description in relation to that. Further detail then set out. If we go to the next page, there's a discussion, or there's a note from Dr. Cash, top of the page, saying it would appear that the CSVM fractionation system can be used to produce an albuminoid product similar with respect to albumin content to the PPF produced at BPL, etc. And then we can see there's a reference, if we go back to the full page, please, next, to the CSVM SPPS production in shift mode. I don't think I need to read that, but if we just look at Dr. Cash's notes, this then is Dr. Cash's assessment. The shift mode experiments demonstrated beyond doubt that PFC has a maximum fractionation capacity in a 46 working week year, using all 15 stations in the CSVM system of approximately 500,000 kilograms of plasma per year, etc. The second paragraph suggests that the existing accommodation would be adequate to cope with 350,000 kilograms a year as fresh plasma, but there was insufficient finishing capacities. And then the third paragraph suggests that on an interim basis in the existing accommodation, subject to agreement by the Medicines Inspectorate, PFC could, given a 3-shift working day and appropriate staffing structure, take on a commitment from the National Blood Transfusion Service of 2 to 2,500 kilograms per week per 46 working week. Little doubt that this would have to be outdated plasma or supernatant 1 until such times as a new freeze dryer was installed. And then there's a reference to the need to obtain clearance from the Inspectorate. Bottom of the page, proposal above is seen as an interim one only, for in the opinion of the author, it would be in the best interest of the UK as a whole to plan the future of PFC towards an operating capacity of around 350,000 kg plasma per year. I just wanted to unpick a couple of points with you, Dr. Foster, if I may. The reference in paragraph 3 of Dr. Cash's notes to the new freeze dryer being required, that was necessary, was it, if anything other than time-expired plasma was going to be used?
That was required for, obviously, freeze-dried products, which really factor 8. But I think what I would comment on here is that even if only PFC could take time-expired plasma, that would release more capacity at BPL to process fresh plasma, because the plant capacity of all of these facilities has to cope not only with the fresh plasma, but with the resultant supernatant to process that to albumin. And if we could relieve BPL of pressure on that route, that would allow them to take in more fresh plasma and produce more factor 8.
So would it be right to understand from this and from your perspective that subject to sorting out financing, shift working arrangements and so on, in terms of what the centre could physically accommodate, it could take the time-expired plasma pretty much straight away and have the indirect consequence for BPL of being able to fractionate more fresh frozen plasma itself. And then in the longer term, with a new freeze dryer installed, PFC would be able to receive fresh frozen plasma from England and Wales and fractionate that to produce factor concentrates. Is that right? Leaving aside Dr. Cash's own particular comments here, do you recall Mr. Watt's views following the PFC shift experiment? What he thought it showed?
Actually, I don't, because as you mentioned, I'd been absent with ill health and I was away for a long time. And when I got back, I was suffering from very severe brain fog that you've heard about in these sessions. And I think Mr. Watt was trying to keep stuff off my desk, so he didn't discuss this with me.
We then, I think, in terms of the handful of documents that you referred to in your witness statement, pick matters up at WITN 6914044. Now, this is not a document you'd have seen at the time. It's an internal DHSS document. But if we go to the third page, we can see the heading PFC Liberton halfway down the page. There's reference in paragraph 10 to the PFC's capacity and the SHHD's estimate as to what PFC could handle if a continuous shift system could be negotiated. It says, last sentence, paragraph 10, revenue costs, including transport and processing, would not be markedly higher than at BPL. And then the next paragraph refers to consideration by the policy steering group. I'm not going to go through the details of that. And then halfway down that paragraph, it refers to it'd be more expensive to build a smaller BPL and invest 4 million in PFC than build a BPL capable of achieving self-sufficiency. In any case, in the view of DHSS officials, it remains highly doubtful whether a shift working agreement can be negotiated with staff at PFC without serious repercussions on pay of other groups in the NHS and the industrial civil service. Now, we'll just leave that there. I want to refer to two other documents, and then I want to ask you to assist in understanding the observations you make in your statement about these materials. So the two further documents are DHSC 0002333_018. This is a letter which I think we've looked at in the course of the current tranche of inquiry hearings. 15th of September 1982, from the Scottish Home and Health Department to the Department of Health and Social Security. Second paragraph refers to noting, not without some sense of relief, that the PFC has been ruled out. There's then reference to the PFC being designed to work on the continuous flow system, capable of a high throughput when operated in this mode. And then there's a suggestion of an amendment to the document that's been provided by the DHSS. It says the impression is given in lines 5 to 7 that the capital investment of 6 to 7 million would be required solely for the processing of English plasma. In fact, about half of this sum will have to be spent in any case to fractionate plasma for Scotland and Northern Ireland to Medicines Inspectorate standards. The next paragraph then refers to a line on the shift working issue, and the letter continues, we here take the view in light of the known attitude of the main Scottish Union official involved that an acceptable agreement can be negotiated, though not without difficulty. I'm a little unhappy about the decision on this topic being based to any material extent on the concept of shift working being too difficult for the NHS. Now, in relation to that paragraph, is that consistent with your own understanding that from the union's perspective, this ought to be capable of being agreed?
Yes, and the trade union official that has been referred to here would be Mr. Craig, who had written in the article that you quoted from earlier, who acknowledged that shift working was required.
And then the next document I wanted to ask you to look at is one that I think you had, well, some involvement with the chain of correspondence that we'll come back to, but it's PRSE 0001727.
Could I just say one thing
Yes.
before we go on to this?
Absolutely.
That we did actually achieve a shift working system at PFC in the early 1990s, and it was negotiated locally, but it was more to do with what was required for high purity factor 8 rather than running the continuous flow modules.
And I think your statement tells us that was 1991. Is that right?
Yes.
So this is a letter we'll come back to because it's part of a chain of correspondence between Lord Glenarthur and Clive Jenkins of the ASTMS, in which you had, I think, a part behind the scenes. But if we just go over the page, we look at the section headed paragraph 5, which suggests that Elstree is capable of fractionating all the plasma currently available. Should the situation arise where the plasma supply builds up beyond the fractionating capacity of the existing laboratory, we should need to examine whether any surplus capacity at PFC could be used. At present, PFC wouldn't have the storage, filling and packaging facilities to handle a substantial amount of extra plasma, even if it were available. So that's the position being set out by the department as at, I think, January 1984. We'll look at this correspondence in more detail later in the afternoon, but what's your perspective, if any, on the suggestion that PFC wouldn't have the facilities there described to handle extra plasma?
I think by the time this was written, these areas were already being addressed following the medicines inspection report, and so there had been advances. So the situation wasn't as is described here. I think there were extra facilities available. And of course, more would be needed. You couldn't just wave a magic wand and expect things to happen overnight. But I didn't see this as an impediment.
And then the last letter on this issue that you referred to in your statement is another letter to the ASTMS. So it's at MACK 0002271_012. So this is from John Mackay, Minister for Health and Social Work, 14th of May 84, to Clive Jenkins of the ASTMS. It refers to the correspondence with Lord Glenarthur and then says this: the function of the PFC is to concentrate on the needs of Scotland and Northern Ireland. It performs this role satisfactorily. We are virtually self-sufficient in Factor 8. As Simon Glenarthur explained in his letter of the 2nd of April, that's a follow-up letter we don't need to worry about, the needs of England and Wales are to be met by a new production unit being built at BPL Elstree and not looking to any expansion of production at PFC. There is thus no need to consider your interesting suggestions whereby this could be achieved. Do you have any observation upon the statement that the function of the PFC was to concentrate on the needs of Scotland and Northern Ireland?
Well, this is the first time that had been made explicit, as far as I'm aware. And prior to that, there'd always been an understanding within PFC that we would be processing plasma from England.
Now, those are the various documents on this issue that you referred to in your witness statement. I now want to ask you to look at your statement, and I just want to go through a number of comments you make and explore some of them with you. It's WITN 6914001, and we can pick it up at page 155. Under the heading comments, halfway down the page, so you having set out the various documents that we've just looked at, you said this: the first impediment to processing plasma from England at PFC was the claim in 1977 that the staffing arrangements were not compatible with the government's income policy. The incomes policy, known as the social contract, concerned annual pay awards, which provided an increase in pay for the same job. PFC was seeking to introduce new terms and conditions of employment to encompass shift working with a suitable rate of pay. As this new rate of pay was for a new job, it should not, in my opinion, have contravened the government's incomes policy. Now, is that an observation you're making effectively wearing your then trade union hat, to some extent?
No, it's just a general observation that, in my understanding of from that time of what the government's policy, incomes policy was intended to achieve, that it was about annual pay awards, and this wasn't an annual pay award.
Okay. The second, or the next point you go on to make is to refer to the opposition from Dr. Lane opposing the processing of fresh frozen plasma. You suggested, implied, he believed that BPL could fractionate all of the available plasma with sufficient capacity to meet the needs of England and Wales for Factor 8 concentrate. If we go over the page, you then continue in the next two paragraphs by saying, that meant the issue being addressed at this meeting was only the processing of outdated plasma, which would result in the production of albumin. As albumin was pasteurised to eliminate the risk of hepatitis transmission, the consideration facing civil servants and government was the cost of importing albumin rather than the risk of disease transmission. And then you say that Dr. Lane's opposition, in his opinion, that PFC would only be dealing with albumin, may have reduced the pressure on civil servants to resolve the apparent conflict between the government incomes policy and the staffing needs of PFC. Could I just ask you to explain a little more what you mean in those two paragraphs?
From the minutes that have been of those meetings, Dr. Lane, as the director designate, made it clear that he didn't see fresh plasma going to PFC because he thought BPL could handle all of that, and all PFC would get would be outdated plasma. Outdated plasma or time-expired plasma was only used to produce albumin, which is a safe product because it was pasteurised, whereas if Factor 8 had been part of the equation and it was known that that had a risk of disease transmission, which was believed to be much greater with imported products, then that would have put more pressure, in my opinion, on the civil servants to try to resolve this problem. But having that issue taken away might have left them under less pressure to try to resolve the situation. So
your take, and ultimately it'll be a matter for submission and for the chair to consider in due course as necessary, but your take on that material that we've looked at was that, is this right, that the civil servants or just decision makers within the departments concerned were not really being confronted with the significance of the fact that this could help address the transmission of hepatitis?
Yes, that's my opinion.
You then, if we then just pick it up, the third paragraph down, you move to a next point. You say, you refer to then the impediment being raised in the 1982 documents, that it could have serious repercussions on the pay of other groups in the NHS and the industrial civil service. And then you continue by saying PFC would have to hire additional staff. Difficult to see how people would have applied for positions involving shift work without a shift premium. Are you there taking issue with the suggestion that it would have repercussions on the pay of other groups in the NHS and the industrial civil service?
No, all I was doing was suggesting that there were actually numerous reasons being cited, not just a single reason, and they were all consistent in their outcome.
And then if we go further down the page, you there then refer to the issue in relation to cost. Your take is that it would have been less expensive ultimately to go down the route of utilising PFC than to go down the route of the full redevelopment of BPL. Is that the point you're making there?
It would have been less expensive and quicker.
And then if we just go over the page, I just wanted to pick up the third paragraph on that page, where you say Dr. Lane's suggestion that Mr. Watt was exaggerating the operational capacity of PFC was incorrect. Can you just expand upon that, please?
Well, I actually can't remember Dr. Lane's comments, but I would agree with Mr. Watt's opinion about the capacity of the process.
Let me just remind you, sorry, it would be easy if I showed you what Dr. Lane had said. It's set out in your statement at page 150. It's material we looked at over the course of the last week. Sorry, page 150, 150. So paragraph C on that page quotes from Dr. Lane's draft proof of evidence, which refers to exaggerated claims made by Mr. Watt, grandiose claims made by those responsible for PFC's administration, and then he refers to the belief that there was any spare capacity immediately available for fractionating plasma as a myth. So that was what Dr. Lane was saying. From your own knowledge of PFC and the CSVM system?
My own knowledge is that the claims being made by Mr. Watt were correct.
Thank you.
And also I would say that I would agree with Dr. Lane when he says that spare capacity wasn't immediately available. If he means immediate, like tomorrow, then that obviously would be true. It would take some time to organise these things.
Can I then, we can take that down. Can I then just ask you some just more general questions? First of all, is it your view, based upon not what is said in any of these documents, but your own knowledge of PFC, its capacity, the CSVM system, is it your view that the PFC could have fractionated plasma from England and Wales as it had been originally designed to do?
Yes.
And as I think you've already alluded to, it may be that would have to have started with the fractionation of time-expired plasma, but once there was a new freeze dryer, it could have then fractionated fresh frozen plasma.
Yes.
Do you have any sense? Do you think that the PFC could have fractionated a third of the plasma from England and Wales, as had been proposed back, I think, at the end of 1969 when Mr. Watt was first designing the new plant?
Yes.
And now, then there are just two further passages I wanted to invite you to comment on in the documents on the issue of capacity. The first is at CBLA 40664. This is a document produced by Dr. Maycock. I just wanted to draw your attention to if you go to the bottom half of the page. Sorry, it's Dr. Maycock's 1977 report on BPL. Third paragraph up from the bottom says this: also in creating uncertainty at BPL is the unfortunate situation in which the problems of BPL as they relate to NBTS in England and Wales seem to have become entangled with the problems of PFC Liberton, the design, size and development of which were carried forward entirely independently, apart from an agreement in principle it should fractionate 500 litres time expired plasma weekly, etc. Planning the future of BPL should not wait until the problems of PFC have been resolved. Were there, to your knowledge, problems at PFC at this time that were an impediment to the PFC fractionating English or Welsh plasma?
No.
And then PRSE 0002268.
Well, it might refer, might it, to the problems of PFC Liberton, as was said, I gather at the time, being uneconomic or unviable if it didn't have enough plasma to process.
I didn't read it that way.
Very well.
PRSE 0002268. These are the minutes of a meeting of Haemophilia Centre Directors, 13th of January 1977. Obviously not a meeting that you'd have been involved in. But I just wanted to ask you about something that's said about PFC's capacity that Dr. Lane took issue with. And I think you're probably the only person from the PFC at the time that I can ask this question of. You may not be able to cast any light on it. It's page 12. No, it's not. Sorry, could you go on to, it's page numbered 12, so it'll be 4 pages further on. It's the internal pagination at the top. Thank you. So if we pick it up, 4 lines from the top, it refers to Dr. MacDonald giving a talk about supplies of factor VIII concentrate, refers to cryoprecipitate. Then Dr. MacDonald referred to the costs of building the PFC, showed figures illustrating the amount of plasma which had been sent to Liberton. Dr. MacDonald said that the PFC at Liberton had the capacity to make 60 million units of factor VIII per year. To reach this target, the centre would need about £25,000 for new capital equipment and money for extra running costs, which would include payment for staff to operate a 24-hour shift system of working. And then it goes on to discuss a number of other matters, including the plan to send plasma to the PFC when Mr. Watt was ready to receive it. Dr. Lane took issue with what Dr. MacDonald there said, and we don't, of course, know if the minutes were accurate. Do you have any observations either about what's said about PFC's capacity in terms of making units of factor VIII, or what it would need by way of equipment?
My understanding is that the equipment would probably be the cost of a freeze dryer, and I think Dr. MacDonald's figure of the million units of factor VIII is probably correct. I did do some calculations when you sent me this to try and work it out, and it did seem to me to be correct. And then
if the freeze dryer is the new capital equipment referred to, is £25,000 as at January 1977 the right kind of ballpark?
That would be possibly the case. I would have to, I can't be certain.
That's fair enough. Can I then just move to the question of Northern Ireland? Your statement tells us you were not involved in the decision-making regarding the receipt of plasma from Northern Ireland for fractionation.
That's correct.
Are you able to assist us in understanding whether it was the Northern Irish plasma was fractionated separately from Scottish plasma or pooled with Scottish plasma?
It was separated to begin with just to be sure that it behaved appropriately and it was validated suitably. And once that had been achieved, it was just mixed in with the Scottish plasma.
We know that arrangement was entered into in the early 1980s. From your perspective at PFC, in terms of the PFC's own capacity, could it have fractionated plasma from Northern Ireland earlier than that?
Yes.
I want to move next then to a different topic, which is hepatitis. You've said in your statement that in relation to hepatitis B, the risks of hepatitis B was something of which all fractionators were well aware. Is that right?
That's my understanding, yes.
In terms of non-A, non-B hepatitis, what's your recollection of your own knowledge of non-A, non-B hepatitis, both as a concept and in terms of its seriousness?
I was aware of it as a concept from around the mid-1970s. I can't be specific about now exactly how I learnt about it, but I do remember there was a member of staff who worked for me who himself had an episode of hepatitis, the fractionation acquired probably, and he took a great interest in hepatitis. I remember him stopping me in the corridor and saying, I've got some good news and some bad news. The bad news is there's a new form of hepatitis. It's called non-A, non-B. The good news is it's no worse than the common cold. And that would have been about the mid-1970s, and I already knew about non-A, non-B when he told me that. So that was the perception that existed at that point in time.
And then how did your understanding of the seriousness of non-A, non-B hepatitis, which obviously sadly is infinitely more serious?
Firstly, I would say we always took it seriously, whether it was even as like the common cold. We still took it seriously, and we would want to deal with it and remove it from the product as a risk. In terms of its clinical seriousness, it was probably not until the early 1980s that began to seep through that this may be more serious than had been originally believed.
Do you recall whether, well, let me put this a different way. We know that there was a publication by Dr. Preston in 1978, which some clinicians at least have described the inquiry as being very significant in the evolution of their thinking. Do you have any recollection of whether that's something that was seen or discussed within PFC at the time?
Probably not within PFC, no.
Do you recall whether you saw the World in Action documentary that was broadcast end of 1975?
I did, yes.
And do you recall whether there were any discussions within PFC about that?
There were a lot of discussions because Mr. Watt took part in it.
And was there any was there any consideration of what the implications were for PFC?
The implication was that we needed to produce more factor VIII and to minimise the importation of commercial factor VIII.
Can we just look at ARCH 609, please? This is back in your evidence to the Archer inquiry. And go to page 45. So if we pick it up at the bottom of the page, this is on the topic of non-A, non-B hepatitis. You said at the bottom of the page, non-A, non-B hepatitis in haemophiliacs was first reported by doctors to a meeting of the World Federation of Haemophilia in 1975. And then paragraph 5, you say, research was begun around the world, including research at SNPS to try to discover the cause of non-A, non-B hepatitis, which was presumed to be due to one or more viruses. What's the research at SNBTS that you were referring to there?
There was a scientist at SPTS called Dr. Robert Hopkins, who was employed full-time to do research on hepatitis, and this was one of the areas on which he specialised. And I think he even published a paper about a potential cause of non-A, non-B, but it turned out to be not correct.
Do you recall there ever being any discussions within PFC in the second half of the 70s into the early 80s about the implications of non-A, non-B hepatitis on PFC's working, in particular as regards pool sizes? Was it recognised that the larger the pool size, and as we discussed this morning, the trajectory was an upwards one, potentially the greater risk of transmitting non-A, non-B hepatitis?
Yes, but the situation was, as I described it this morning, that the objective was to minimise the use of imported concentrates, and the only way to do that was to produce more from PFC. So pool size wasn't an option. Reduction in pool size wasn't an option. And I also mentioned how by that time we had the group that Professor Cash had set up to look more closely into all of these things, and at no point did they suggest the pool sizes should be reduced, bearing in mind that, as I said this morning, SNBTS provided cryoprecipitate as a small pool product.
Can I then just ask you about some research in relation to factor 9, WITN 22350010, please? Yeah, I think I've got it wrong. Hold on a second. WITN 22350010. And if we go to the next page, this is a publication in the British Journal of Haematology, 1981, use of factor 9 concentrates in man, a 9-year experience of Scottish concentrates in the southeast of Scotland. It's by Drs. Prowse and Cash. If we just go to page, I think it's 13. Next page, sorry. We can see under the heading acknowledgements, there's thanks to you for your help in preparing and reviewing the manuscript, so something that you would have seen at the time. Did you have any involvement in the study itself that was described in this paper?
No, I didn't. And I think this paper just describes the use of factor 9 concentrates from PFC, probably over a period of time prior to its publication, which would have been the 1970s. Dr. Prowse asked me if I could provide details of the methods of manufacture and the properties or characteristics of the products, and that's what I gave him, and that is what I reviewed, and I had no involvement in any of the medical work.
If we just go to the top of the page, then maybe you won't be able to assist with the other question. But picking it up, end of the 5th line, in addition, other side effects of factor 9 concentrate therapy must be considered. Apart from the perennial problem of hepatitis B, recent findings on the transmission of non-A, non-B hepatitis by factor 9 concentrates make it probable that many of the patients with milder disorders presented above would now be treated more conservatively, either not at all or with fresh frozen plasma, at least until further data is available on individual concentrates. The incidence of hepatitis following the use of the 2 concentrates described in the study is currently under investigation. Do you have any knowledge of, or did you have any involvement in, the investigations there referred to in relation to the incidence of hepatitis?
No, I don't know that.
I'm going then to move to the issue of AIDS. So I note the time. I'm moving to a completely new topic. We could take the break early, or I can get started for 5 minutes. I'm in your hands.
Well, let's have it all in one chunk, shall we?
Yeah.
And so we'll take a break now and come back at 3:30.
Okay.
So 3:30, if you please.